This time, I'd like to recognize Dr. Jojo Thomas. Come on up, our Associational Missionary, who crisscrosses our county, multiple counties, supporting and strengthening our churches in the Chattahoochee Baptist Association. And as a child of a director of missions, I just want to say thank you. I know you don't get to worship a lot with your family. We thank you for being here. And we know that the Lord has given you an itch, so come on up and scratch it.
Thanks, appreciate it. Thank you, Matt. God bless you. God bless all you guys. And Danny, I just want to say congratulations. You know, I have opportunity and am blessed as a director of missions to work with a lot of pastors. And I'm not going to surprise anybody in the room this morning if I say that they don't come any better than Danny Jones. And so I just... Thank God for the chance we've had to work together. You know, some of y'all might think everything that goes on at the association office is real spiritual, and we do try to make it as spiritual as we can. We have a lot of guys who come by our office or who call or, you know, and usually the first person they engage when they say, and always invariably it's a similar message, hey, I feel like God's called me to preach, or I feel like God's called me from whatever place they may be in to this part of Georgia, and I need to pastor a church here. Can you help me find a church? And usually the first person who engages those calls or folks who drop by is one of our secretaries, and I'm often not around, and so I'm hearing about it after the fact. And so my first question for the secretary, whoever it was that has spoken with them, is usually this: did they look like they had good sense? That's my first question. Because I'm just here to tell you, not all of us preachers look like we have good sense. And not all of us act like we have good sense. There's good ones and bad ones. It's just like any other slice of life. And so my first question is always, did they act like or look like they had good sense? And I'm just here to tell you. We talked a lot of Danny's qualities this morning, but this may sound like it's not a big thing. To me, it's a big thing. I don't know folks, very many folks who have better sense than Danny Jones has. And I tell people who've not met Danny, I'll say, you know, if Andy Griffith could be a pastor, his name would be Danny Jones. It's true. So, Danny, we appreciate your good sense. And it's already been said, you know, I appreciate his consistency. I appreciate the fact that when I think about all the churches that God's given me the privilege to deal with, one of the churches I seldom worry about, especially as it relates to what's being taught and how closely what is being taught aligns with the Word of God. I never have a concern about Northlake Baptist Church. I thank God for Danny in his consistently to speak the truth and to connect the truth to what's going on in the world around us so we know how to apply it. I thank God for that consistency. It's already been said in terms of your diligence, and I think about this passage in 1 Thessalonians, and it's appropriate. Everything y'all are doing here today is appropriate. As uncomfortable as it may make Danny to be the center of attention, it is appropriate for us to recognize. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 12, Paul says, "We request of you, brethren, that you appreciate those who diligently labor among you and have charge over you in the Lord and give you instruction, and that you esteem them very highly in love because of their work." So, Danny, we do esteem you very highly in love because of your work. Now, one of the things we also appreciate about Danny is that he has a sense of knowing what's important. Now, I kidded with him coming down the hall here this morning, coming up into the worship center. You know, you don't get into this business to try to be the center of attention. And that's one of the things I love about Danny, is he does not desire to be the center of attention. His desire is that the Lord Jesus is always the center of attention. His desire is that whatever we do as a church on any day of the week, and especially on Sunday morning when we get together to worship, the Lord Jesus is the center of attention, and that how we can glorify God is the focus of everything we do. And so this morning, then, having said just some things I believe with all my heart, appreciation for Brother Danny, I think Danny, because he is the man he is, would not want us to spend a whole lot more time this morning talking about him. There you go. But he would prefer that we shift our focus now and talk about that question. How is it then that Northlake Baptist Church can glorify the God who made us, the God who sent his Son to save us? How is it, even though the last 10 years have been such a joy? And I look out this morning at the crowd that's here and thank God for the changes that have taken place here at Northlake and the way God's blessed Northlake Baptist Church through Danny's ministry. It's been a wonderful 10 years. But how can we make sure, and how can you make sure as God's church and God's people, that the story we write in the next 10 years is even better? How can we make sure that we are glorifying God to the very max of our ability? Now, having said that, let me ask you to open your Bibles to the text that I'd like to look at this morning with you, and that's in the book of Hebrews, chapter 12. First couple of verses. The writer of Hebrews says, "Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God." You read this text in that little section where he refers to that great cloud of witnesses surrounding us. And I think what he's pointing to, reminding us about, is all that list of people that he has given us in the 11th chapter of Hebrews. People who walked and lived in a world much like ours. People who experienced life with all of its highs and lows, all of its disappointments, all of its victories, all of its limitations, all the places where we ourselves are imperfect or the world around us is imperfect. But each of those people in that 11th chapter of Hebrews found a way to glorify God. No matter what the hardships, no matter what the obstacles, they found a way to glorify God and to accomplish the mission that God had given them to accomplish. And so the writer calls them to mind here. He says, therefore, since we are surrounded, it's as if there is some great stadium. Here we are, the people in the present day, who are surrounded by this great cloud of people who've already run their race. And he says to us, keep them in mind. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us also, he says, lay aside every encumbrance, every weight, the sin that so easily entangles us, and let us run with patience or endurance the race that is set before us. So how is it that we can make sure that we continue to glorify God, not just in the past 10 years, but in all the years to come? I want you to stop and consider with me what the writer has to say to people in his present day. I think it speaks to us in this day and time. And the first thing that I think he's trying to call us to is to remember, because we are the children of God, remember that we have a race to run. What he refers to in that last part of the passage where he says, run with endurance the race that has been set before us. You know, I read some years ago the story of a man named Edwin Hendricks, who, some of you may know him. He practiced medicine over in Habersham County for something like 24 years. There was an article came out in the Gainesville Times about Mr. Hendricks several years ago to say that at the age of 57, though he had been a doctor all this time, and I would imagine, like so many guys in the medical field, he had probably done well financially, but at the age of 57, when so many guys who have been physicians are eyeing a golf course and they've just got plans in mind of how they're going to bankroll all that money they made and just sort of coast on to the end of life. At the age of 57, Edwin Hendricks decided to enroll in the National Guard. Now, at that time, he was one of the oldest people ever to enroll in the National Guard. You say, why did he do that? Now, I don't know all of his reasons. I think it had much to do with the fact that it was a response on his part to 9/11. But it was also a response on his part to this conviction, this belief that his life was not to be about just entertaining himself and that the purpose of his existence was not just to sort of coast to the end of life, but in fact, he had a race to run. You know, Debbie and I yesterday went up to Blairsville, Georgia. You know, it was a beautiful day. We got in the car at about 7:30, drove up, had breakfast at a place up in Blairsville. We saw this it's the first of the fall festivals that we ran into. And so yesterday there was a heritage festival at Blairsville, Georgia. And so Debbie and I were walking around at the Heritage Festival, and there was an FFA, place down there. One of the displays was an FFA sort of a display where they had some of the animals that these young farmers are raising. So there was a couple of chickens there in a cage, and there were a couple of rabbits there in a cage, and there was a calf, and there was a mule, and there was a pig, and the truth is, most of these animals were not particularly worried about the fact that they were in a cage, that the pig was having a hard time with it, and he was trying to get out. But I guess I'm willing to bet that if somebody put a little food in that portable pen that they had for him, that he would have been perfectly satisfied to stay there and lay there like a pig in the sunshine and just enjoy life. He's perfectly satisfied, like that calf would be, like that mule would be, if you feed him and just give him something, a place to stand. And he doesn't have a race to run. The pig was not trying to get out of the cage because he had an agenda that he had to complete. It wasn't he had a mission in life. It's like, and I suppose it's fine when you drive by a field full of cows and they're just contented to gaze there and eat and sleep and do nothing else but exist. But you and I are not made that way. God did not create you and me just to exist, to eat and sleep and sort of move through life. We have what the Bible refers to as a race to run. Now, I don't know this morning what your race might be. And maybe there's somebody here like Edwin Hendricks, and you work in the medical field. Maybe you're a nurse. Maybe you are a doctor. The race that God has given you to run is a race to alleviate suffering, to make a difference in the world around you by doing that. Maybe there's someone here this morning who is committed to the military. You have a race to run, a passion, a calling from God to serve your nation. You can't exist just by getting up, going to bed every day, and coasting to the end of life. Your life is about accomplishing something, and it's a call of God on your life. Maybe there's somebody here this morning who God's called you as a teacher in our public schools, which may not be an easy calling. But God's called you to make a difference in the lives of those young people, or those teenagers, or those first graders, whatever grade it is. You stood up this morning, some of you who are serving as Sunday school teachers or Awana workers. God's given you a race to run. I don't know this morning, every person in this room, what your race might be. But I do know this, that the key to an effective life as a child of God is to stay connected to that race, to understand what it is, and to give yourself to it. I want to recall you to that race this morning, to remember what your race is. If you're a child of God, that race is not just an incidental thing or an accidental thing. The text here says that we are to run the race that is set before us. It doesn't say the word right there, but the implication is pretty clear that it's set before us by God Himself. And that as a child of God, because God sets a race in front of you, you're not just coasting through life. You're not just entertaining yourself. You're not just frittering life away with habits of this type or hobbies of one type or another. That your life has purpose and meaning. And it touches eternity right there. It's one of the things that sets us apart from every other creature God makes, is that our lives can touch an eternal opportunity. If we if we stay connected with the race that God Himself has given us to run. Do you know what your race is? Churches have a race to run, just like people do. Northlake Baptist Church it's given by God. It's placed before this church by God Himself. Northlake Baptist Church has a race to run. Thank God. And thank God that you have been running it. I want to challenge you to continue to do that. And I need to challenge you because as human beings, it's true for us as individuals, it's true for churches as well. It is so easy to lose sight of that race. People do it. When people lose sight of their race, they begin to substitute things, lesser things, for the race that God has called them to run. When people lose sight of their race, and it is so common. In fact, I think it's probably fair to say that we have all done it at some season. We have to reconnect from time to time to the race that God has given us to run. You know you're losing sight of that race when you begin to substitute things that are lesser, when you begin to substitute just whatever your hobbies are, when you begin to substitute instead of running the race that God's given you to run. You begin to watch a whole lot more TV than you used to watch, or you begin to fill your life with distractions. You just begin to survive. Make sure the bills are paid. I need to say this morning that does not lend energy or joy or passion to anyone. And if you ever reach a point in your life where you feel like the air's gone out of it, there's no energy or joy or passion in it, it probably has to do with the fact that you've lost connection with the race that God called you to run. The same thing is true for churches. Churches sometimes lose their energy, their joy, their passion. And it always goes back to this temptation we have to get disconnected from the race that God's called us to run. When churches get disconnected from their race, usually it begins to take the form, it's very predictable. The form often becomes where we begin to focus on the past. I don't mean that we just for a second or two stop and thank God for the last 10 years. That's a good thing. I just mean we try to live in the last 10 years or the last 20 years or the last 50 years. And we begin to worship the past rather than listening to God about the mission that He's given us to run as a church and being passionate about that. We begin to avoid all risks. We begin to prefer whatever is known, whatever is familiar, whatever is safe. We look at the bottom line on the budget every month and we say, okay, we paid the bills. Somehow or other, we've stopped asking, are we accomplishing the mission? Are we running the race? You know, Danny, I know you've done a lot of things these last 10 years. You've preached a lot of funerals, done a lot of weddings, visited 10 million hospitals, I'm sure, hospital visits, or shared the gospel, who knows how many times, preached a lot of sermons. I'm willing to bet every so often, it's probably been a couple that's come up to you and said, would you help us renew our vows? Doesn't happen very often, but once in a while, it's always sweet. When two people who have made that commitment in the past, but somehow drifted away from it or lost touch with it, gotten disconnected from that early commitment, they realize they need to reconnect. And so they say to their pastor, help us renew our vows. And I just want to call Northlake Baptist Church this morning on behalf of your pastor who would say the same thing. I want to call you to remember what your race is. And I want to call you this morning to renew your vows. How can we make sure that 10 years from now, the joy we have for the past 10 years is even greater than today? It can be so, but we need to remember that we're running a race. And nothing is a worthy substitute for that. It's how we glorify God as God's people. Now, we also need to remember this morning that we all have a temptation to set that race aside. We need to remember what the race is. We need to renew our vows. We need to recommit to it. But we need to remember as we do that these temptations are not going away. The temptation to substitute something else for the race that God has given you to run. You know, I think about that passage in Matthew, the 11th chapter and the 12th verse, where Jesus said, from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and violent men take it by force. Now, you don't hear a lot of sermons about that text. And I'm not here this morning to preach on that text, except to say it is a reminder to me that when you walk with God, when you try to run the race that God has given you to run, it is not a casual endeavor. There are going to be all types of opposition to that. Some of the opposition for God's people as an individual or as a church is going to come from the external world. But some of the opposition is going to come from the internal. From all the temptations that are part of my life that I need to overcome. And it's really what the writer of Hebrews is referring to when he says, therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside. If it's true that to walk with God, to run the race that God's given you to run is going to generate conflict, if that's true, then you're not going to succeed in that endeavor by approaching it casually. You're going to have to make some tough decisions from time to time. It's what the writer refers to when he says, let us also then lay aside. What do we need to lay aside? One of the things he refers to, he says, we need to lay aside the sin that so easily entangles us. We're human. Same temptations that these people in the 11th chapter of Hebrews had to face, we have to face. All of us are sinners. And the truth is that at any given point for just about everybody in the room today, that there is something that we need to lay aside that threatens to make it very difficult to run that race, maybe even impossible. I was up early this week, I was up at my dad's home place in Blue Ridge. And Dad's gone on to be with the Lord. He went to be with the Lord a couple of years ago, but we still have the home place right now, and I was up there and got to thinking about the fact he's got a creek that runs through his property, and every so often, invariably, one of the trees on the sides of that creek will fall over and just be laying down in the water. And it was several years ago on Thanksgiving. I had eaten a whole lot, and I was laying there like a pig in the sunshine, just enjoying myself. And my dad came in, and he said, Jojo, you need to go put these waders on. We're going down to the creek. We're going to get the tractor. We're going to jerk that log out of the creek. And I'm just here to tell you this morning, my first response, laying there on the sofa, full of turkey and everything else, and watching football, and I didn't want to be interrupted. That's the last thing I wanted. My first response was, why do we need to do that? Now, if you've had anybody here who grew up on a farm and you've done that, you know why you need to do that. The reason you need to do that is today it's just a tree. But before very long, and it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. Before very long, that tree is going to start to snag everything that comes down through that waterway. I mean, it'll snag paper bags, it'll snag lawn chairs, it'll snag other tree limbs. And if you don't do something about that, what is today just one tree in your creek is going to become a tangled mess. In fact, it will become a mountain of trash. And what is not that hard to jerk out of the creek today, you have to get a bulldozer to get that mountain of trash out of the way. I mean, it's going to become a tangled mess. All of us have trees fall across our creeks from time to time. And we almost always say the same thing. I don't know why I got to worry about that. Can't I just ignore that? It's not hurting anything. Nobody even knows about it. I mean, that unforgiveness that I'm nursing inside my heart, that bitterness that I'm nursing inside my heart. Or that habit that ought not be a part of my life, or that streak of laziness that I don't really want to confront, or do I really need to do anything about it? I was watching a guy play basketball one time, and the game was going on, and he had the ball in his hands, and he was dribbling down the court. It was getting near the end of the game, and he looked down, and he noticed his shoelace was untied. And he grabbed the ball under one arm, and he did like that, and he stopped. He stopped the whole game. I thought to myself, why stop the whole game? Because one shoelace is untied. Why would you do that? But you know why. Because if you don't tie that shoelace at the worst possible moment, you're going to get tangled up in it. At the worst possible moment, when the game is on the line, you're going to trip and fall, and the ball's going to go off, and you're going to lose possession, and you may lose the entire game. And the writer of Hebrews is trying to say this to us about something in your life or my life that we may think is not a big deal. But when he says the sin that so easily entangles us, what he means is that this thing that I think is not a big deal has potential to make it almost impossible for me to run my race. It can ruin my reputation. It can ruin my discipline. It can ruin my ability to accomplish what God's called me to do. It becomes a tangled mess. It may limit your ability to run the race God's called you to run, or it may make it impossible to run that race. But you can do something about that today. You can lay that aside. And he speaks about things that are wrong, sins, the sin that so easily entangles us. But he also speaks about things that are not wrong. And this may be just as big an issue. For some of us, it's bigger. Things that are not wrong, but they're wrong for me. What he refers to when he says, let us lay aside every encumbrance, every weight. They're not wrong things, they're just wrong for me, or maybe they're wrong for now, if I'm going to run the race God's called me to run. If I'm going to take that seriously. Now, I tell this story, and you may have heard me tell it. I asked Debbie permission to tell it, and she's gracious. She knows what it's like to be a preacher's wife. First fight Debbie and I ever had in our marriage when we were married, first fight we ever had was we were going on vacation. And it was because the way I pack for vacation and the way she packs for vacation are way different. I mean, when I'm packing for vacation, I'm just going to tell you, men, you will probably relate to this. I pride myself on packing the least amount possible. Anybody here do this? Good for you. It's all right. And so we might be going for 2-3 days. I'm thinking, how can I minimize what I'm going to take? And I've got it down to where I'm just taking this one little bitty bag. I'm just here to tell you, Debbie does not look at it that way. So we had this little car, just a 2-seater car. We had a very small trunk. And she starts bringing stuff out to go on vacation. And so here's one bag. Here's another bag. And here's another bag. And after a while, I'm saying, what is all this stuff? And it's like, and so we had a great big fight about it. And I'm just here to tell you, ladies, I have learned over time that it is okay. It is okay for her to pack that way. It's just not my preference. I mean, Debbie is what I call a possibility packer. You know what that means? That means we're going to pack for every conceivable possibility. If it's July, we have got a snowsuit in there. We pack for every conceivable possibility. That's completely different from the way I do it. And so early in our marriage, this would cause a whole lot of conflict. Later on, I'm pretty foolish, but I have figured a few things out. I have figured out that there is nothing wrong with being a possibility packer. If you've got a big enough car, there's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with being a possibility packer if you're going on a vacation. But there's a whole lot wrong with that if you're going to run a race. A whole lot. Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also, they had to do it, let us also lay aside every encumbrance, every weight, anything that is getting in the way of me being able to run the race that God put me on this earth to run. Anything. It can be a good thing. Listen, this morning, I'm not here to, there's nothing wrong with having 2 homes, one lake house and one mountain house, or there's nothing wrong with having a boat. There's nothing wrong with having tickets to the University of Georgia football team. If you want to get rid of yours, you come see me and tell me about it. There's nothing wrong in my mind with playing a baseball game on Sunday. There's nothing wrong with so many things but they may be wrong for you. Other people can do them, other people can celebrate them, that's fine. But I think about this text in the 4th chapter of Mark's Gospel. Hear this with me as Jesus speaks about the parable of the soils. And he's summing this up at the end. You remember this text when he's talking about that soil that did not bear fruit. As the worries of the world and the deceitfulness of riches and the desire for other things enter in and choke the word, and it becomes unfruitful. Now, how many of us want that to be written on our tombstone? Unfruitful. Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside. This is a conflict. It is a war to be fought. There is a temptation that will always be there to substitute something else for the race that God's given you to run. And it introduces itself in any number of ways. Sometimes it introduces itself because there's some sin you don't want to just do surgery on and remove from your life. You don't want to deal with the fact that this is going to entangle me. Sometimes it's not a sin. Sometimes it's something that is just a distraction. It's just a weight you're trying to carry on your back. It's not a bad thing in and of itself, but it is causing you not to run the race God's called you to run. And you can't afford that. Remember your race, remember your temptations. And the last thing I would say about this subject this morning is remember where to focus. See, the truth is that running a race, whether you're talking about a church that runs a race or a person, is always hard. I mean, I wish I could rewrite this text and say, let us walk with patience the walk that God has put before us. Or, let us stroll with patience the stroll that God has set before us. Or saunter with patience. It's like, no, the word is race, not stroll. Races are always excruciating. And because of that, you've got to understand, if you're going to run that race, how to sustain yourself through it. I'm willing to bet this morning there's someone here who has set aside the race God's given you to run because you've grown tired. Your pastor's been in ministry longer than 10 years. I'm willing to bet there have been many days when he's grown tired or he's been disappointed or he has become discouraged. We all do that. And if he were standing here this morning, he would probably bear down on this next little text I'm going to read to you, where the Bible, the writer of Hebrews, gives us the response or gives us the way that we overcome that reality. He says you need to fix your eyes on Jesus. Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every weight or encumbrance and the sin that so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance, the race that has been set before us. How? Looking unto Jesus. How? Fixing your eyes on Jesus, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of God. See, the problem for most all of us, me included, is that we are so often fixing our eyes on something other than Jesus. You remember that story where Peter is by the fireside with Jesus there after Jesus has been raised, and Peter had denied him 3 times, and there's that episode where Jesus gives Peter the opportunity 3 times to proclaim his love for him. And then Jesus kind of sums that up. He says, when you were young, you used to gird yourself and go wherever you wanted to go, but when you're old, someone else will gird you and take you where you don't want to go. Peter's not real excited about that prophecy. And so he starts to look around and he spots another disciple over here and he says to Jesus, well, what about him? You ever done that? Hey, what about her? Now, she doesn't have the health problems that I have. He doesn't have the financial burdens that I have. He doesn't have this situation or that situation. I mean, isn't it so much more tempting just to focus on other people when God gives us a race to run and begin to point out all the reasons why life's not fair? I mean, isn't it so much more tempting to focus on other people? But the Bible says, fixing your eyes on Jesus. I mean, we are great at this. We fix our eyes on other people. We fix our eyes most of the time on the obstacles, whatever obstacles are out there. And listen, they will always be there. I think about the spies that, went into the promised land and how, 10 out of 12 of these, that's probably a pretty good percentage in terms of Baptist churches, are people who react with faith or people who react with fear. I mean, 10 out of 12 of these, there's giants in the land. This is ridiculous. We cannot accomplish what you say God's calling us to do. Just look at the facts. Danny, you ever had somebody come up to you and say that? Just look at the facts, and you're saying, I don't know all about the facts. I just know that God's called us to run a race. And isn't it tempting constantly, whether you're talking about your church or you're talking about your own life, to begin to outline all the reasons why it can't be done, all the reasons why we shouldn't say yes. And I think God is always standing back and just waiting for us to say, it's never about what you're able to do. It's always been about what I'm able to do. You willing to believe that? We fix our eyes on other people, we fix our eyes on the obstacles, and maybe the most of all, we fix our eyes on our own limitations. And so here's Moses, who God calls to be his instrument to lead a great movement of God. But all he can see is his own limitations. You ever done that? I couldn't teach that class. I've never done that. I can't take that position. I can't serve, Moses says, I'm not eloquent. They won't listen to me. He's got a string of excuses as long as his arm. It's as if God has to, nail his feet to the floor and make him deal with this call of God to run this specific race. And Moses wants to look at his own limitations. But it's not other people, and it's not the obstacles, which may be real. And it's not me, my limitations that I'm supposed to be looking at. If I look at those things, I'm here to tell you, I'm often tempted to look at those things. If I look at those things, the day will come when I will cease to run the race God's called me to run. But I can run it every day. If I do what the scripture says here, if you fix my eyes, the Bible says, fixing your eyes on Jesus. That's not a one-time thing. It's not just once a week when we come here on Sunday, though that's something we ought to do, fix our eyes on Jesus or refix our eyes on Jesus. It's a daily thing. I need to fix my eyes, not on other people, not on the obstacles, not on my limitations. Goodness, those are real. But every day. Sometimes it's not every day, sometimes it's every hour, sometimes it's every minute. I need to fix my eyes on Jesus, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of God. Now you ask me, can we come back here 10 years from now and celebrate a decade that is even greater than the decade that's just passed? Absolutely. Absolutely. God is not finished with Northlake Baptist Church. He has a race for Northlake Baptist Church to run that touches eternity, that will change things eternally. And you have opportunity to be a part of that. And thank God that you have a leader who understands that and who leads toward that. Let me say this to you. God has a race for you to run. And you get to choose that race each new morning. Not just once, not just on Sunday. Each new morning, you get to choose that race. Yes, It will require that you lay aside some things. It's not an easy thing to do, but it brings joy and passion and energy to life. 10 years from now, you run that race, you'll have a story to tell.